Booth had been moving quickly. After running out the backstage at Ford's Theater, he jumped on his horse and moved quickly out of the city. He rode out of the alley onto F Street, continued east to New Jersey Ave, around the Capitol, and then continued southeast down Pennsylvania Avenue. Then riding south along 11th Street, he crossed over the Anacostia Bridge and out of D.C. into Maryland. Once across, he caught up with David Harold around 11 o'clock, and they briefly stopped at the tavern run by Mary Surratt, mother of John Surratt, both conspirators. They headed to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, an associate whom Booth met a few months earlier. By this time, Booth's leg was really hurting, and they had 17 miles of travel ahead of them through heavy swamp. They arrived at the Mudd farm at 4 a.m., where the doctor set Booth's leg and put him up in a second-floor bedroom to get some rest. Mudd sent Booth and Harold out late in the afternoon of the next day. By this time, the city of D.C. was in an uproar. There were rumors circulating, citizens were scared, Confederate sympathizers were attacked out of anger, and the city was almost in chaos. Late in the evening of April 15th, Booth and Harold moved through the swamps toward the Potomac River, where they came to the home of Samuel Cox, a Southern sympathizer, who told them they needed to hide out in some thick woods. The next morning they were given some rations, newspapers, and advice from Thomas Jones. He told them they should stay put because there were too many soldiers looking for them. Booth and Harold shot their horses to maintain silence, and at one time, soldiers were so close to the location they could be heard. While in the thicket of woods and reading the daily newspapers, Booth was able to read the reactions to his deed. He began writing a journal as a way for him to voice his own reactions, give rationales, and explain his own perspective. He was upset for not being looked at as a hero who saved the U.S. from the tyrant. Although, unbeknownst to him, there were Southerners who quietly celebrated his deed. While Booth and Harold were waiting in the woods, D.C. detectives were trying to find the other conspirators. On April 17th, they went to the boarding house of Mary Surratt and questioned her. At that unfortunate time, Lewis Powell, lost in the city and returning to the only place he knew, was arrested as well. Also arrested were Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, after a letter was found in Booth's hotel room. Then Edmund Spangler, a stagehand at Ford's Theater, was arrested. The final arrest came on April 20th when George Atzerodt was arrested at his cousin's farm. Also on April 20th, Secretary of War Stanton put out a $100,000 reward for the capture of Booth, Harold, and Surratt, the most by the government in the history of the United States. Back in Maryland, after 5 days of cold and hunger in the woods, Harold and Booth are finally able to make their way to the Potomac River and into a boat. Their escape to Virginia is almost complete. Unfortunately, due to the darkness, instead of moving across the river, they went upstream, and after a long night of rowing, they were still in Maryland. They rested and waited in the weeds on the shore of the river, eventually crossing the Potomac on April 23rd. There they met some Confederate sympathizers who assured them they would find help at the Garrett Farm. Getting to the Garrett Farm required crossing the Rappahannock River. While crossing at Port Conway, they were noticed by the wife of the ferry operator, who then told Federal cavalry what she had seen. At the Garrett Farm, Booth and Harold were helped. They were given quarters in an old tobacco shed by the owner, Richard Garrett, and here they waited. On April 26th at 2 a.m., authorities arrived at the Garrett Farm after getting information from one of the Confederate soldiers who helped Booth the previous day. Surrounding the barn, they ordered the two out. Harold begins to plead with Booth to surrender. Booth isn't going to, though. He sends him out of the barn, and Harold is arrested immediately. Booth did not surrender. He knew it was escape or death. Hoping to take Booth alive, the detectives set the barn on fire at 3 a.m. Booth eventually tried to make a run for it, and in the commotion was shot in the neck. He died of his wounds early in the morning as the sun was coming up on April 26th. Before he died, he said, "Tell Mother I die for my country." And later his final words, while looking at his hands, was useless, useless. On May 10th, the trial for 8 accused conspirators began on the grounds of the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington, D.C. Dr. Mudd was given life in prison for aiding and conspiring with Booth. Spangler was given life in prison for aiding Booth in his escape from the theater. Arnold and O'Laughlin were given life sentences for conspiring to kidnap the president in Booth's earlier plot. Mudd, Arnold, and Spangler were pardoned by Andrew Johnson in 1869, and O'Laughlin died in prison in 1867. The remaining 4 conspirators tried, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt, were convicted for conspiring with Booth and sentenced to death. On July 7, 1865, they were hung. On April 21st, Lincoln's funeral procession left Washington, D.C. and followed the same path back to Springfield that he had followed to D.C. for his first inauguration. For the 12 days it took to get to Springfield, thousands of supporters came to pay their respects and mourn the loss of Abraham Lincoln. It also was a time for Americans to mourn their own losses sustained during the tragic Civil War. On May 4, 1865, the former President of the United States, Abe Lincoln, was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery, outside the city of Springfield, Illinois.